The first snow had not fallen yet, but Winter Creek Ranch already sounded like a place being warned. The wind came down from the Wyoming hills with a low, lonely cry, pushing dust across the yard and rattling the loose barn door as if an unseen hand kept trying to get inside. Cattle stood tight near the fence, restless and thin from a hard year. A lantern swung on the porch of the main house, throwing weak gold light across the steps where a widow stood with a hammer in one hand and worry hidden deep behind her eyes. That was the evening Jonas Whitaker came walking over the ridge with 2 children and nothing left to trade except his hands. He was not old, but grief had put years on him. His coat was torn at one shoulder. His boots were cracked white with dried mud. A handcart bumped behind him carrying a blanket roll, a rusted toolbox, and a baby girl wrapped so tightly only her little red nose showed. Beside him walked a boy of about 7, thin and silent, holding one corner of the cart as though letting go might make the whole world disappear. Jonas had buried his wife 6 months earlier outside a little railroad town near Cheyenne. Since then, every sunrise had been a bargain with hunger. He had fixed wagon wheels for bread, mended fences for beans, patched roofs for a bed in somebody's shed. But a man with children was not always welcome where work was hard and food was counted. 3 ranches had turned him away. One said they had no use for a widower with a baby. One said the boy could stay in the bunkhouse, but the baby could not. The last man looked at Jonas's daughter and said, "A child that small needs a woman, not a drifting repairman." Jonas had picked up his toolbox and walked out before his anger could become words. Now, as the sun sank behind the dull purple hills, he stopped at the fence of Winter Creek Ranch and looked toward the woman on the porch. Her name was Meredith Cole. People in the valley called her a hard widow, though most men who said it had never carried a ranch alone through 3 bitter seasons. Her husband, Daniel Cole, had been crushed under a timber wagon 2 winters before. Since then, Meredith had kept the ranch alive with stubborn hands, sleepless nights, and a ledger that never showed enough money at the bottom. She was 32, with dark auburn hair pinned low beneath a plain brown hat, strong shoulders from lifting feed sacks, and eyes that had learned not to beg for help. Her dress was faded at the cuffs. Her gloves were worn smooth at the palms. Nothing about her looked soft at first glance. But when she saw the baby's head move beneath the blanket, the hammer lowered in her hand. Jonas opened the gate but did not step past it. "Ma'am," he called, his voice rough from the trail, "I'm looking for work." Meredith studied him from the porch. Most men who say that mean they want wages. "I need milk first." The answer stopped her. The boy beside Jonas looked at the ground. The baby stirred and gave a faint, tired cry, the kind that had almost no strength left in it. Jonas swallowed. Pride had kept him upright for miles, but it could not feed a child. He lifted his eyes to the widow's face. "Give my children milk," he said. "Let them sleep somewhere out of the wind. I'll fix your ranch before winter breaks it." The wind struck the barn again. The loose door banged hard against its frame. Meredith's gaze moved past him, toward the sagging roofline, the crooked corral gate, the hay stacked too close to damp ground. She did not like a stranger walking onto her land and naming its weaknesses. She liked it less because some part of her knew he had seen too much in only a minute. "What makes you think my ranch needs fixing?" she asked. Jonas did not smile. "Your barn doors face the north wind, that pump line sits too shallow, your hay is drawing wet from below. The fence posts by the creek are leaning because spring melt has eaten under them, and if a heavy snow comes, that dead cottonwood row will drift the barn shut before morning." Silence held between them. The boy gripped the cart tighter. The baby whimpered again, her small mouth moving against the blanket. Meredith stepped down from the porch. Her boots made a quiet sound on the packed dirt. For a moment, Jonas thought she might tell him to leave like the others had. Instead, she walked straight to him and held out her arms. "What is her name?" Jonas looked down at the baby as if the question touched something tender. "Ruby." Meredith's face changed so slightly most people would have missed it. The name found a soft place in her. And the boy? Samuel. Samuel did not look up. Meredith reached for Ruby carefully, not like a woman used to babies, but like someone handling a memory she was afraid to drop. Jonas hesitated only a breath before letting her take the child. His arms, empty at last, trembled from more than cold. "The milk comes first," Meredith said quietly. "Your promise can wait until morning." She turned toward the house, and Jonas stood there as if he did not understand kindness when it came without bargaining. "Come inside," she added. The kitchen was warmer than anything the children had felt in days. A black stove glowed in the corner. Dried herbs hung from a beam. A blue tin cup sat alone beside the lamp on the table. Meredith warmed milk slowly, testing it against her wrist before giving it to Jonas. "Not too fast," she said. "An empty stomach can turn against too much kindness." Ruby drank in weak pulls at first, then stronger ones. Jonas bowed his head over her, his large hand cradling the back of her blanket. Across the table, Samuel stared at the bowl of stew Meredith placed before him as though it might vanish if he moved too quickly. "Eat," she said. He ate without a word. Halfway through, he slipped a piece of cornbread into his coat pocket. Jonas saw it, shame crossed his face. Meredith saw it too, but said nothing. She simply cut another piece and set it beside the boy's bowl. Samuel froze. "That one is for later," Meredith said, as if saving food were the most ordinary thing in the world. Only then did the boy's shoulders loosen. Jonas looked at her across the lamplight. Something passed between them, not romance yet, not trust, but the first quiet recognition of two people who had both lost more than they admitted. Later, Meredith opened the old foreman's room at the back of the house. Dust lay over the bed frame, but the blankets were clean. From a loft, she brought down a small cradle, unfinished on one side. One rail was rough and a thin carving line stopped halfway across it. Jonas touched the edge lightly. "Your husband made this." Meredith's mouth tightened, started it. "For a child." She did not answer right away. Outside, the barn door banged again in the rising wind. "For a hope," she said at last. That night, Ruby slept in the unfinished cradle. Samuel slept on the narrow bed with one hand still guarding the cornbread in his pocket. Jonas sat awake in a chair near the door, afraid that if he slept too deeply, Mercy might be gone by morning. Meredith stood in the kitchen after the lamp was lowered, listening to the old ranch groan in the cold wind. A stranger had come asking for milk. But as the barn door slammed once more in the dark, she wondered if winter had brought him to her for a reason far larger than hunger. Before sunrise, Jonas Whittaker stepped outside while the sky was still black and the stars looked sharp enough to cut. He had slept only an hour, maybe less. Not because the bed was poor, but because his body had forgotten how to trust walls. For months, he had listened through the night for a child's cough, a loose horse, a stranger's bootstep, the small signs that trouble was near. Even now, with Samuel sleeping under a real quilt and Ruby tucked inside a cradle beside the warm room, Jonas could not rest. So he walked. The cold bit through his coat before he reached the barn. Frost silvered the rails. The ground near the water trough had hardened overnight and the pump handle squealed when the wind pushed against it. He did not take up tools at once. He only watched. That was the first thing Meredith noticed about him from the kitchen window. Most hired men started with noise. They hammered where wood looked weak, kicked at doors, cursed old hinges, and made a show of strength before breakfast. Jonas did none of that. He moved across the ranch like a man listening to a sick animal breathe. He tied a strip of cloth near the barn entrance and watched how it twisted in the wind. He crouched beside the haystack and pressed his fingers beneath the bottom layer. He poured a dipper of water into a shallow rut by the pump and followed the way it moved. He laid his palm against the house logs where the cold had slipped through the cracks. By the time Meredith came outside with her shawl pulled tight, Jonas was standing near the dead cottonwood row northwest of the barn. "You fixing it with your eyes?" she asked. He turned, surprised to find her there, trying to find what Winter will fix first if I don't. She did not smile, but something in her eyes warmed. The eastern sky had begun to pale. Her auburn hair, pinned beneath her hat, had loosened slightly at her cheek. She carried 2 tin cups of coffee, one in each hand. Without ceremony, she offered him one. Jonas took it. Their fingers nearly touched through the steam. "Tell me what you saw," she said. He looked toward the barn. "The doors are wrong for this wind, not wrong for all seasons, just wrong for the worst one. A storm from the north will drive snow straight into that opening. Once it packs there, you will waste half a day digging before you can even reach the cattle." Meredith followed his gaze. "Daniel built that barn." "I figured." Her face tightened. "Then choose your words carefully." Jonas lowered his cup. He knew spring rain, he knew summer heat. He built strong for what he fought most, but winter has been changing through this basin. Wind cuts lower now, snow drifts heavier against flat faces. He paused. A good man can build something good and still need another season to teach the rest. Meredith looked away, but not before he saw the grief move across her face like a shadow. Most men had either praised Daniel too much to be useful or criticized him too quickly to be trusted. Jonas had done neither. "What else?" she asked. He knelt by the hay. "Bottom layers are damp. If you leave it, you'll lose feed from underneath and not know how much until you need it most. The pump line needs protection. The trough freezes too easy because water sits where it should drain. Your fence near the creek needs bracing before the ground swells. The house needs chinking, not all of it, just the places where the logs have pulled apart. And the cottonwoods. They stand too close." Meredith's eyes flashed. "Daniel planted those." "I'm not saying cut them all. You said they would bury my barn." "They might, not because they're useless, because they're placed like a wall where a sieve would serve better." He took a breath, choosing plain words. A windbreak should weaken the wind, not dare it to climb over and strike harder. Meredith looked at him a long moment. Wind pulled at the edge of her shawl. In the barn, a cow shifted and blew steam through her nostrils. "How long?" she asked. 6 weeks before deep winter, if the weather gives us mercy. We don't have money for 6 weeks of mistakes. Then we start with what costs the least and saves the most." That answer seemed to matter to her. She was used to men bringing grand plans and bigger bills. Jonas spoke like a man who knew a bent nail still had work left in it. Inside the house, Samuel appeared at the door, rubbing sleep from his eyes. For one frightened second, he looked around the yard as if expecting the cart, the road, and hunger to return. Meredith noticed. She lifted her voice gently. "There's breakfast on the stove." Samuel did not move. Jonas turned. "Go on, son." "Ruby. She's asleep." Samuel nodded, but his eyes stayed on Meredith, measuring whether kindness lasted after sunrise. Meredith understood more than he knew. "There's cornbread too," she said, "fresh, not borrowed from last night." The boy's face changed barely, but Jonas saw it. He looked down into his coffee, blinking once against something he did not want the widow to see. After breakfast, Meredith gave Jonas 1 week. 1 week, she said in the yard, tying her work gloves. "You prove you can fix more than you can talk. After that, I decide if you stay." Jonas nodded. "Fair." Samuel stood nearby with a small piece of wood in his hand. Ruby slept inside by the stove, her breathing soft and steady. Jonas began with the hay. He did not ask Meredith to stand aside. He handed her a pitchfork and she took it without offense. Together, they lifted the bottom layers from the stack. A sour, warm smell rose from beneath. Meredith's mouth tightened, not from disgust but from anger at herself for missing it. Jonas did not say, "I told you." That silence helped him more than pride would have. He built a raised crib from old pine rails stacked behind the shed. Samuel measured the space beneath with his little piece of wood. 8 inches, Jonas said. Samuel checked it carefully. 8. Again on the next side. 8. With every number, the boy's voice grew stronger. By noon, he was walking around the frame like a small foreman, serious as a judge. Meredith watched him from the corner of her eye. He's handy. He used to sing while I worked, Jonas said. Used to. He drove a nail through the rail before answering. He stopped after his mother died. The words landed softly between them. Meredith pushed loose hay from her sleeve. Loss makes quiet rooms in people. Jonas looked at her then, not long, just enough to understand she was not only speaking of Samuel. By late afternoon, the hay had been moved into smaller stacks with narrow air spaces between them. It did not look as grand as one tall mound, but it smelled clean, and the bottom rested off the wet ground. Meredith marked the change in her ledger because numbers, unlike hope, could be checked later. Near sunset, a rider appeared beyond the fence. He came on a tall black horse, wearing a fine wool coat too clean for a working day. His hat sat low, but there was no mistaking the confidence of a man used to owning whatever he looked at. Meredith's shoulders stiffened. Jonas noticed, "Who is that?" "Grant Sutter," she said. "He owns half the grass west of here and wants the other half." Grant stopped at the gate without dismounting. His eyes moved from the rebuilt hay crib to Jonas, then to Samuel. "Evening, Meredith," he called. "Heard you took in a stranger." "I took in a worker." Grant smiled. "With children." Jonas set his hammer down slowly. Meredith stepped forward before he could speak. "His children are not your concern." Grant leaned on his saddle horn. "Winter is everyone's concern. A widow with debt should be careful who she lets sleep under her roof." The words were polite enough for public hearing, but the insult beneath them was plain. Meredith's chin lifted. "If you came for business, put it in writing." "I did." Grant pulled a folded paper from his coat. "My offer still stands. Sell before the snow traps you here. I'll pay enough to clear Daniel's debts and give you a decent life in town." The yard went still. Jonas looked at Meredith, but she never took her eyes off Grant. "This is my decent life," she said. Grant's smile faded, his gaze shifted to Jonas. "And you think this man will save it?" Meredith turned slightly, just enough for Jonas to see the answer before she spoke. "I think he knows where the wind enters," she said. Grant looked at the barn, then at the dead cottonwood row and gave a short laugh. "Wind does not care about poor men's promises." "No," Jonas said quietly, "but it punishes rich men's pride the same." Meredith glanced at him, startled. Grant's face hardened. For a moment, the cold between the two men seemed sharper than the weather. Then Grant folded the paper and tucked it back into his coat. "Winter will settle this argument." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving hoofprints pressed deep in the frozen dirt. Samuel moved closer to his father. "Pa." Jonas rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "What is it?" "If Winter settles it, what if Winter picks him?" Meredith heard the fear in the question. She expected Jonas to answer with comfort. Instead, he looked toward the barn door shaking in the wind. "Then we make sure Winter has better evidence before it decides," he said. That night, after the children slept and the house grew quiet, Meredith found Jonas in the yard, standing beneath the swinging lantern, studying the dark shape of the barn. "You should rest," she said. "So should you." Neither moved. The wind lifted a loose strand of her hair across her cheek. Jonas reached as if to brush it away, then stopped himself. His hand fell back to his side. Meredith noticed the small restraint. Somehow, it touched her more than boldness would have. "Tomorrow?" she asked. "The water line," he said, "then the windbreak." She looked toward the cottonwoods Daniel had planted with such hope. Letting Jonas change them felt like letting another man lay hands on her past, but keeping them as they were might cost the future. At last she nodded. Jonas watched her go back inside, the lamplight catching the tired grace in her step. He had come for milk, he had been given a week. But as the first hard frost settled across Winter Creek Ranch, he understood the truth. A week might not be long enough to save Meredith Cole's ranch. And it might be far too long to keep his heart from remembering how to hope. By the third morning, Winter Creek Ranch no longer felt like a place waiting to fail. It still looked worn, the barn roof still sagged at one corner, the corral rails were still patched with mismatched boards, the wind still came over the hills with teeth in it, but now there were marks of purpose everywhere. Stakes stood near the barn, a trench opened beside the pump, hay sat raised above the wet ground, strips of cloth fluttered from fence posts like small white warnings. Meredith Cole watched it all from the porch with Ruby in her arms. The baby had taken to her in a way Meredith did not understand. Ruby's tiny hand curled into the front of her dress whenever Meredith carried her. At first, Meredith had held the child stiffly, afraid of doing something wrong. She had never been given the chance to learn the small habits of motherhood. Daniel had built a cradle for a hope that never came, and after he died, Meredith had covered that cradle with canvas and told herself not to look at it again. Now Ruby slept in it every night. That morning, the baby rested against Meredith's shoulder while Jonas and Samuel worked near the pump. The sight unsettled her, not because it was unpleasant, but because it felt too natural too soon. Jonas stood in the shallow trench with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, studying the water line. Dirt marked his shirt. His dark hair, streaked with trail dust, fell loose across his forehead. He had the look of a man who had fought many hard days and expected more, yet every time Samuel came near, his voice softened. "Not there," Jonas said gently. "If you stand on the edge, it'll crumble under your boot." Samuel stepped back at once. "Here. That's better." Meredith had seen fathers speak to children with impatience. She had seen men bark orders at boys barely tall enough to carry a pail. Jonas did not do that. Even tired, even hungry, even carrying grief, he gave Samuel steadiness. She looked down at Ruby. "Your father is a good man," she whispered. Ruby only slept. A wagon rattled up the road before noon. Ruth Bell, the nearest neighbor, arrived with 2 loaves of bread, a sack of dried beans, and the kind of sharp eyes that saw more than people said. Ruth was nearly 60, widowed longer than Meredith had been married, with silver hair tucked under a black bonnet and a tongue honest enough to scare liars. She climbed down from the wagon and looked from Jonas in the trench to Meredith holding the baby. "Well," Ruth said, "that is a picture nobody in Red Hollow will know what to do with." Meredith shifted Ruby higher on her shoulder. "Good morning to you too." Ruth smiled. "It is morning. Whether it is good depends on what trouble you are making." Jonas climbed from the trench and removed his hat. "Ma'am." This the man asking milk for his children. "Yes," Meredith said. Ruth studied Jonas, not unkindly but without softness. "And are you worth the milk?" Jonas glanced toward the pump line. "Not yet." The answer surprised a laugh out of Ruth. Honest at least. She carried the bread inside and set it on the kitchen table. Samuel followed at a careful distance, his eyes fixed on the loaves. Ruth noticed the way his hand moved toward his coat pocket, checking for yesterday's saved cornbread. Meredith noticed too. Ruth looked at Meredith and lowered her voice. "That boy has known too many empty mornings." "I know. And you." Meredith frowned. "What about me?" "You are holding that baby like you are afraid someone will ask for her back." Meredith looked away through the window. Jonas was pointing out something to Samuel near the trench, his hand broad and patient over the boy's shoulder. "She is not mine," Meredith said. Ruth's face softened. "No child is owned, honey. Some are only trusted to us long enough to change who we are." Meredith said nothing. Outside, Jonas began the waterwork. He knew there was no time or money to rebuild every line before snow, so he chose the section that mattered most, the stretch between the well, the trough, and the milk cows. He dug only where he had to, lined the exposed part with salvaged wood, wrapped the weakest joint in wool waste, and shaped the ground so standing water would not freeze in place. Meredith helped without being asked. She carried boards. She held the line steady. When he needed another hand in the trench, she stepped in before he could call Samuel. By afternoon, mud streaked the hem of her dress, and a smear of dirt crossed her cheek. Jonas noticed it when she handed him a wrench. "What?" she asked. He looked away too quickly. "Nothing." Meredith touched her cheek, found the dirt and wiped it with the back of her glove. "You could have said." "I didn't mind it." The words were quiet, almost lost under the wind. Meredith stilled. Jonas bent back over the pipe as though he had said nothing at all. But the moment stayed there, small and warm, between the cold earth and the open sky. Samuel, who missed less than adults thought, looked from one to the other and said nothing. That evening the pump worked smoother. The trough filled quicker. When Jonas opened the drain, the last of the water ran out instead of sitting in the pipe. Meredith crouched beside it, listening to the thin trickle disappear beneath the ground. "You make it sound simple," she said. "It isn't simple, it's just honest. Water always tells where it wants to go. And people." Jonas wiped his hands on a rag. "People hide it better." Their eyes met for a moment. A horse shifted in the barn. Somewhere inside the house, Ruby woke and gave a small cry. Meredith rose at once, but Jonas was already moving toward the door. Then he stopped himself. For months, Ruby's crying had meant only his responsibility. Now another person heard it too. Another person cared enough to move. Meredith saw the hesitation. "She knows your voice," she said. "She knows hunger better." "Not anymore." Jonas looked at her then, and something in his face nearly broke her heart. He wanted to believe it. That was the painful part. He wanted it so badly he was afraid to touch it. Before he could answer, hoofbeats sounded near the road. Grant Sutter rode into the yard with 2 men behind him. This time he did not stop at the gate. He came through as if Winter Creek already belonged to him. Meredith stepped onto the porch, Ruby in her arms. Jonas moved quietly to stand near the bottom step. Grant's eyes swept over the fresh trench, the raised hay crib, the marked posts, and the cloth strips tied near the barn. "You are making quite a show," he said. Meredith's voice was calm. "You ride far for a man not interested." "I am interested in land that won't be wasted." Jonas felt Samuel come up beside him. The boy pressed close but did not hide. Grant looked down at Samuel and smiled without warmth. Teaching him ranch work already. Jonas's jaw tightened, teaching him to stand where he is useful. Grant turned his attention to Meredith. "There is a council meeting in town in 3 days. Stock owners will discuss winter road access. I hope you plan to attend." "I do." "With him," Grant nodded toward Jonas. "With my foreman," Meredith said. The word struck Jonas like a hand on the shoulder. "Foreman. Not drifter, not repairman, not stranger." Grant heard it too. His mouth hardened. A widow should be careful naming a man before knowing what road he came from. Meredith looked at him steadily. "A man's road matters less than what he does when he reaches your gate." Grant leaned forward in the saddle. "And what happens when he leaves it?" The question found its mark. Jonas felt it in the way Meredith's fingers tightened around Ruby's blanket. He knew the fear. Everyone left eventually, some by death, some by choice, some because hunger forced them onward. He could not promise what spring would bring. He had made too many promises to graves already. Grant straightened, satisfied by the silence. 3 days, he said. Come here, reason before winter teaches it harder. He rode out with his men, leaving dust and cold behind him. For a long moment no one spoke. Samuel looked up at Jonas. "Are we leaving?" The question cut through the yard sharper than Grant's warning. Jonas crouched in front of him. "Not tonight." Samuel's eyes searched his father's face. "After the week." Jonas had no easy answer. He had taught his son not to trust lies, even kind ones. Meredith stepped down from the porch. If your father keeps working, she said softly, then you keep sleeping warm. Samuel turned to her. You promise? Meredith looked at Jonas first, then she looked back at the boy. I promise there will be breakfast tomorrow, she said. It was not a grand promise, it was not forever, but Samuel understood it better than forever. That night after the children were asleep, Meredith opened the ledger and wrote down what had been done. Hay lifted, pump line cleared, drain working, trough filled and emptied. Jonas stood near the stove, turning his hat in his hands. You did not have to call me foreman, he said. I do not use words I do mean. I have only been here 3 days. You saw more in 3 minutes than some men saw in 3 years. He gave a tired smile. Seeing is easier than staying. Meredith closed the ledger, then stay through the next job. Outside, the wind moved against the walls. Inside, the 2 tin cups sat beside the stove, steam rising from both. Jonas looked at them, then at the widow who had given his children milk before asking for proof. I'll start the windbreak at dawn, he said. Meredith nodded. And neither of them said what both had begun to fear, that the storm outside might be easier to face than the feelings growing quietly inside that house. The windbreak began with a line in the dirt. Jonas drew it with the heel of his boot before the sun had fully climbed over the eastern ridge. Meredith stood beside him with her arms folded, watching the mark cut across the open ground northwest of the barn. To her, it looked too far from the building to matter. To Jonas, the distance mattered more than the wall itself. 32 feet from the barn at the closest point, he said, a little wider where the ground dips. Meredith looked from the mark to the dead cottonwoods Daniel had planted years before. Their bare branches rattled in the morning cold, thin and brittle as old bones. Daniel planted those by hand, she said. I know. You don't know. Jonas turned toward her. He did not argue, he only waited. Meredith's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed low. He brought the saplings home tied to the back of a freight wagon, said the ranch needed shelter before it needed paint. He planted them in a storm because he was too stubborn to wait for a clear day. Jonas looked toward the trees again, and this time he saw more than bad placement. He saw a young husband with mud on his knees, a wife watching from the porch, a dream pushed into the ground one sapling at a time. I won't cut them unless we have to, he said. Meredith studied him. Then what will you do? Use what they still give. We'll trim the dead branches, weave them with willow and pine, and set the new wall where the wind can spend its strength before it reaches the barn. She looked doubtful, a wall full of holes. A wall too tight becomes another cliff. Wind climbs it, drops behind it, and buries what you meant to protect. Meredith's eyes moved over the boot-drawn line. And you learned that where? Railroad camps, freight yards, a cattle station north of Laramie, he paused, and once by getting it wrong. That answer pleased her more than confidence would have. They worked all morning. Jonas drove the first post. Meredith held it steady with both hands while he lifted the heavy driver and brought it down again and again. The sound carried across the yard, deep and sure. Samuel gathered smaller willow branches into piles, sorting them by length the way Jonas had shown him. Ruby sat wrapped in a quilt inside a wooden wash basket near the porch, chewing happily on the corner of her blanket while Ruth Bell watched her for an hour before riding on to check another neighbor. By noon, the frame had begun to rise. The wind caught Meredith's hat once and nearly carried it away. Jonas caught it against his chest before it could tumble into the corral. When he handed it back, her fingers brushed his. For a second, neither moved. Then Meredith took the hat and set it firmly on her head. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. You can call me Meredith. The words were simple, but they changed the air between them. Jonas looked at her as if the name had been placed carefully into his hands. Meredith, he said. Her name sounded different in his voice, softer than she expected, warmer than she was ready for. She turned away too quickly and picked up another willow branch. Don't make a habit of saying it like that. A faint smile touched his mouth. Like what? Like you mean it. The smile faded, not from hurt but from understanding. I try not to say things I do mean. Meredith bent to the work, but her hands were not quite steady. By the second afternoon, the L-shaped frame stood taller than a man. Jonah's left gaps where the wind could pass through weakened. Meredith suggested crossing the willow diagonally in one section where the land dipped. Jonah's tested the idea by tying cloth strips along the posts. When the wind came, the strips showed the air spreading instead of rolling downward. He glanced at her. That was better than my way. Meredith raised one brow. Careful, a woman might get used to hearing that. Samuel laughed. It was a small laugh, sudden and unsure, as if it had escaped before he could stop it. Jonah's froze at the sound. Meredith did too. Samuel looked embarrassed and bent quickly over his pile of branches. Jonah's went back to tying the willow, but his eyes shone in the cold light. Meredith saw it, and something inside her softened again. That evening they all ate at the same table. It had not been planned. Samuel sat beside Ruby's cradle, feeding her tiny bits of softened bread while Jonah's tried not to look too grateful. Meredith served stew, then sat across from Jonah's with the ledger beside her. The house felt different with 4 people in it, not crowded, not noisy, just alive. After supper, Samuel carried the bowls to the basin without being asked. Ruby made a delighted sound from the cradle, and Meredith leaned down to touch the baby's cheek. Jonah's watched her with an ache he did not know how to hide. My wife used to hum when Ruby fussed, he said quietly. Meredith looked up. Jonah's seemed surprised by his own words. For months he had spoken of Lydia only when facts required it. Born in Kansas, died after childbirth, buried near Cheyenne, no extra details, no open door. What did she hum? Meredith asked. He looked toward the stove. A church tune, not always the same words. Sometimes she forgot them and made up new ones. Did Ruby like it? Ruby was too small to know. His voice lowered. Samuel did. The boy standing near the basin did not turn around, but his shoulders changed. He was listening. Jonah's swallowed. After Lydia died, I tried humming it once. Samuel asked me to stop. Meredith did not offer pity. She only stood slowly, lifted Ruby from the cradle, and began to hum under her breath. The tune was not Lydia's. It could not be. It was something older, something plain and gentle, a melody Meredith's own mother had sung while kneading bread. Ruby quieted almost at once. Samuel stayed by the basin, still facing away, but he did not ask her to stop. Jonah's looked down at the table. If this quiet moment touches your heart, stay with the story, because some kinds of love do not arrive like thunder. They come softly, one warm room at a time. The next day brought trouble. A hard squall swept over the basin near mid-afternoon, fast and sharp enough to test the unfinished windbreak before Jonah's was ready. The cloth strips snapped tight. Snow dust, though thin, raced across the ground. At first, the new wall did exactly what he hoped. The wind weakened before reaching the barn. Then one woven section, near the center, bowed inward. Jonah saw the mistake at once, too tight. The wind climbed the wall, curled over, and slammed down behind it. Dry snow and dirt began drifting toward the barn entrance. One of the milk cows balked in the passage and kicked hard against the gate. Samuel shouted. Meredith dropped the rope she was coiling and ran toward the cow. Jonah's reached the willow section and cut away several branches with quick strokes. The loosened pieces whipped in the wind, striking his coat and face, but he kept cutting until the wall breathed again. Meredith widened the cattle passage while speaking low to the frightened cow. Easy, Juniper, easy now. Look at the lantern, that's it. Jonah's glanced back. Lantern. She hates dark corners. He looked toward the shadowed turn in the offset entrance. Meredith had seen what he had missed. He grabbed a hook, hung a lantern high at the bend, and the cow moved forward, nervous but steady. The squall passed as quickly as it came. The yard stood quiet afterward, except for the creak of willow and the heavy breathing of people who knew they had nearly failed. Jonas wiped blood from a shallow scratch along his cheek. I built it too tight. Meredith leaned against the gate, catching her breath, and I made the turn too dark. Samuel looked between them, waiting for anger, waiting for blame. Instead, Jonas picked up the fallen willow branches. We fix both. Meredith met his eyes. Yes, we fix both. Something in that answer settled Samuel more than any promise could have. Mistakes did not mean leaving. Mistakes meant working again. Near dusk, as they repaired the windbreak, a wagon stopped beyond the fence. Two of Grant Sutter's hired men sat watching. They said nothing, but their smirks carried far enough. Jonas kept working. Meredith kept working too. When the men finally rode off, she muttered, "By morning, all of Red Hollow will hear your wall failed." Jonas tied another diagonal branch into place. Good. Meredith turned, good. If they hear that, maybe they'll also hear we fixed it before dark. She looked at him for a long moment, then she laughed under her breath, tired and real. It was not the laugh of a woman saved. It was the laugh of a woman no longer standing alone. That night, Jonas remained outside after Samuel and Ruby had gone to sleep. Meredith found him by the windbreak, one hand resting on a post, eyes lifted toward the north. The moon had risen behind thin clouds. The repaired willow frame cast broken shadows across the frozen ground. "You're bleeding again," she said. He touched his cheek. "It's nothing." She held out a clean cloth. Most men say that when they want someone to argue. He took it with a quiet smile. "Do you plan to?" "No." She stepped closer and before he could stop her, gently dabbed the scratch herself. The touch was brief, careful, almost practical, but Jonas stood very still under it. Meredith realized how close they were only when the cloth lowered. The wind moved between them, not harsh this time, almost shy. Jonas looked at her mouth, then away, fighting something in himself. "I should not forget why I came," he said. "For milk," she whispered. "For my children." "And now?" His eyes returned to hers. Before he could answer, a distant rider appeared on the moonlit ridge, moving fast toward the ranch. Meredith stepped back. Jonas turned toward the sound. The rider reached the gate breathless, his horse lathered and trembling. It was one of the town hands from Red Hollow, his face pale in the cold. "Mrs. Cole," he called. "Grant Sutter called the council early, tomorrow morning. He's telling folks your ranch is unsafe, and if they vote against your road access, you'll be cut off before the first blizzard." Meredith's face went still. Jonas looked from the messenger to the dark line of the North Hills. The windbreak had survived its first test. But now, before winter could decide the ranch's fate, Red Hollow would. Morning came cold, gray, and watchful. Meredith Cole dressed before the stove was fully awake. She pinned her hair tighter than usual, buttoned her plain black coat to the throat, and stood for a moment beside the unfinished cradle. Ruby slept with one small fist curled beside her cheek. Samuel lay on the narrow bed with his back to the room, but Meredith knew he was awake by the stillness of him. Jonas stood near the door, his hat in his hands. "You don't have to come," Meredith said. He looked at her. "Yes, I do. This is my land they'll be judging. And my work they'll be mocking." Her mouth tightened, but not from anger. She had spent 2 years walking into town alone, carrying debt papers, feed bills, and the quiet shame people placed on a widow who refused to sell. She knew how men like Grant Sutter smiled in public while closing doors behind her back. Jonas seemed to know it too. Ruth Bell arrived just after dawn to watch the children. She brought goat's milk, a basket of biscuits, and no questions. When she stepped inside, Samuel sat up at once. "Pa's leaving?" he asked. "For the meeting," Jonas said, "not for the road." Samuel's face stayed guarded. He had learned that adults often used small truths to hide larger ones. Meredith knelt beside him. Your breakfast is here, your sister is here, Ruth is here, your father and I will be back before supper. Samuel looked at her. You promise? The question had become his way of asking whether the ground would stay under his feet. Meredith did not rush the answer. I promise we will try with all we have. Samuel studied her, then nodded. It was not the answer he wanted, but it was an honest one. The ride to Red Hollow took almost an hour. The road dipped through frozen creek beds and pale grass heavy with frost. Jonas rode Daniel's old sorrel mare, borrowed from Meredith's barn. Meredith rode beside him on a bay horse with a white mark down its face. Neither spoke much at first. The closer they got to town, the more Meredith seemed to draw inward. Her shoulders stayed straight, but her eyes went distant, as if she were already hearing the voices waiting for her. Jonas finally broke the silence. What did Grant mean by road access? Meredith kept her eyes on the trail. The winter freight road crosses 2 shared sections before it reaches my place. Stock owners vote each season on who helps maintain it. If they name my ranch unsafe or wasteful, they can refuse priority clearing. They cannot take my land, but they can leave me last in line when snow closes the basin. And if you're last? Feed runs short, milk sales stop. A ranch can die without anyone touching the deed. Jonas looked ahead toward the town roofs. That's what he wants. He wants the spring water and the lower meadow. Daniel would never sell, neither will I. The way she said Daniel's name told Jonas that loyalty was not just love. It was armor. It had kept her standing, but it had also kept her from setting anything down. Red Hollow looked smaller than its pride. A dusty main street, a livery stable, a church with a bell that leaned slightly west, a meeting hall beside the mercantile, its windows already glowing with lamplight though the morning sun had risen. Men turned as Meredith and Jonas tied their horses outside. Some nodded, some whispered. A few stared at Jonas's patched coat and rough toolbox strapped behind the saddle. Grant Sutter stood near the hall steps, dressed in a dark coat with a silver watch chain shining against his vest. He smiled as they approached. Mrs. Cole, he said, you brought your foreman. Meredith did not slow. You moved the meeting early. I thought I should bring the reason you were afraid to wait. A few men nearby hid smiles. Grant's jaw shifted. Inside, the hall smelled of coal smoke, damp wool, and old pine boards. Ranchers filled the benches. Edwin Price, the county livestock inspector, stood near the front with a notebook tucked under one arm. He was a lean, serious man with gray whiskers and eyes that missed little. Jonas recognized the type. A man more interested in proof than noise. The council chairman, Amos Reed, called the meeting to order. We are here to discuss winter road priority, shared clearing, and reported safety concerns regarding Winter Creek Ranch. Meredith sat straight-backed on the front bench. Jonas stood behind her, hat held low. Grant rose first. He spoke smoothly, too smoothly. He said Winter Creek was underprepared. He said the barn had structural weaknesses. He said Meredith had taken in an unknown drifter and allowed him to build untested systems too close to livestock. He spoke of children under a widow's roof with a softness that made the words sound worse than accusation. Then he unfolded the paper from his coat. I offered Mrs. Cole a fair purchase before winter, Grant said. Not to take advantage, but to prevent loss. If her cattle suffer because of foolish experiments, the whole basin may suffer. Disease, feed shortage, blocked roads, these things do not stop at property lines. Murmurs moved through the room. Meredith's hands remained folded in her lap, but Jonas saw her thumb press hard against her glove seam. Amos Reed turned to her, Mrs. Cole. Meredith stood, every eye in the hall fixed on her. My ranch has weaknesses, she said. The room shifted, surprised by her honesty. Some were there when my husband died, some I should have seen sooner, some I saw and could not afford to fix the grand way men prefer to discuss in warm rooms. Her voice held steady. Mr. Whittaker has not hidden those weaknesses. He found them. He has repaired what we could repair, reused what we could reuse, and kept a ledger of every change. Grant gave a soft laugh. A ledger does not stop snow. No, Jonas said from behind her, but it tells you whether pride is feeding cattle or wasting hay. The hall went quiet. Amos Reed looked at him, stepped forward. Jonas did. He was aware of his worn coat, his rough hands, the eyes measuring him. Once, before Lydia died, he had been respected along freight lines. Men had trusted him with bridges, wheels, pumps, and roofs because he got them through bad weather. Since then, hunger had turned him into a stranger at every gate. Now Meredith's future stood beside his name. "What exactly have you changed?" Edwin Price asked. Jonas answered plainly, no grand promises, no fancy language. He explained the hay crib raised from wet ground, the smaller stacks with breathing space between them, the drained water line, the boxed coupling, the widened cattle passage, the lantern at the dark bend, the new windbreak set away from the barn, not against it. Grant interrupted, a willow fence with gaps in it. Jonas turned toward him. Yes. Some men laughed. Jonas waited until they stopped. Because a tight wall makes the wind climb. When it drops behind, it buries the very place you meant to protect. A loose windbreak weakens the gust before it reaches the door. It does not win a war with winter. It only makes winter spend strength in the wrong place. Edwin Price watched him closely. You tested this. In yesterday's squall, first section was too tight, it failed. We cut it open, changed the weave, and tested again. You admit it failed? Yes. Grant smiled. That should settle it. Jonas looked at the men in the room. A man who cannot admit what failed before the blizzard will bury animals after it. Silence returned, heavier this time. Meredith looked at Jonas and something in her chest moved. He was not defending himself. He was defending the right to correct a mistake before pride turned it deadly. Edwin Price opened his notebook. Mrs. Cole, are you willing to let me inspect the ranch tomorrow? Yes, Meredith said. And keep 3 weeks of records. Morning and evening temperatures, feed use, water freezing, barn moisture, bedding condition. Yes. Grant's face darkened. We cannot delay every road decision for one widow's experiment. Amos Reed leaned back. We can delay final priority 1 week, until Inspector Price reports what he sees. Grant stood, and if a storm comes before then? Meredith answered before Jonas could. Then Winter Creek will face it with work already done, which is more than I can say for men who spend clear mornings making speeches. A few ranchers chuckled openly this time. The vote passed, not a victory, not yet, but a stay. 1 week. Outside the hall, Meredith breathed as if she had held air in her lungs the whole meeting. Jonas stepped beside her in the cold sunlight. You did well, he said. So did you. I nearly lost them when I admitted the wall failed. No, she looked at him. That is when some of them started believing you. Grant came down the steps behind them. His voice was low enough that only they heard it. You think this changes anything? Meredith faced him. It changes today. Grant's eyes moved to Jonas. Men like you always leave when the food runs thin. Jonas's hands tightened around his hat. Men like you always think food is the only reason to stay. Grant's smile thinned. Careful, Whitaker, Red Hollow knows nothing about you except that you arrived hungry. Jonas stepped closer, but Meredith touched his sleeve, not to stop him like a warning, to remind him he was not alone. Grant noticed the touch. His eyes sharpened with a different kind of interest. So that is how it is, he said. Meredith dropped her hand, but the damage had already been done. On the ride home, she stayed quiet. Jonas knew why. Rumors did not need truth. They only needed a moment. By tomorrow, Red Hollow would turn that touch into a story. Halfway down the trail, snow began to fall in tiny dry grains, though the sky still showed pale light behind the clouds. Meredith pulled her horse to a stop near the ridge overlooking Winter Creek Ranch. From there, the property looked fragile: a worn barn, a thin line of willow, a house with smoke bending hard from the chimney. Jonas stopped beside her. "I am sorry," he said. "For what?" "For giving them something to talk about." Meredith looked at him, tired and brave. "Jonas, they talked when I grieved too long, they talked when I worked too hard, they talked when I refused to sell, they will talk if I breathe wrong on a Sunday." He almost smiled, but her next words stopped him. "What frightens me is not their talk." "What then?" She looked down at the ranch, where Samuel would be waiting for a promise to walk back through the door, and Ruby would be waking in a cradle Daniel never finished. "What frightens me," she said softly, "is how quickly your children made that house feel less empty." Jonas said nothing. Meredith turned her horse and started down the hill before he could answer, perhaps before she could bear one. That evening, when they reached home, Samuel ran to the porch but stopped himself before throwing his arms around Jonas. The boy was still learning whether happiness was safe. Jonas knelt and opened one arm. Samuel stepped into it. Meredith watched father and son hold each other in the yard, while Ruby cried from inside, hungry and alive and certain someone would come. If you believe a lonely house can become a home one small kindness at a time, do not forget to like this story, because Winter Creek's hardest test is still coming. Later after supper, Meredith opened the ledger and wrote the date. Jonas stood beside her, reading over her shoulder. "Inspector comes tomorrow," she said. "Then we show him everything, even what failed." She looked up, especially what failed. Their faces were close in the lamplight, close enough that Jonas saw the faint gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough that Meredith saw the fear behind his restraint. Neither moved. Then a sharp knock struck the door. Meredith opened it to find a folded paper pinned beneath the iron latch. No rider waited outside, only hoofprints led away into the dark. Jonas took the paper and unfolded it beneath the lamp. The message was short. "Ask Whitaker where he was the night the Laramie freight bridge burned." Meredith looked at Jonas. All warmth left his face. Outside, the snow thickened over the yard, and for the first time since he arrived, Jonas Whitaker looked like a man facing a past he had hoped winter would bury. The paper shook once in Jonas Whitaker's hand. Not much, just enough for Meredith Cole to see that the words had struck something old and painful. "Ask Whitaker where he was the night the Laramie freight bridge burned." The stove cracked softly behind them. Wind pushed dry snow against the kitchen window. Samuel sat at the table with a half-finished biscuit in his hand, watching the adults with the stillness of a child who knew trouble before anyone named it. Ruby stirred in the unfinished cradle, her tiny fingers opening and closing in sleep. Meredith reached for the paper. Jonas did not stop her. She read it once more, then folded it carefully and laid it on the table as if sudden movements might make the accusation larger. "Is it true?" she asked. Jonas lifted his eyes. "That the bridge burned," he said. "Yes." Her voice stayed calm, but her hand rested on the back of a chair to steady herself. "That you were there." "Yes." Samuel's face turned pale. Jonas saw it and closed his eyes for a second. He had wanted to choose the hour when his son heard this story. He had wanted to speak it beside a warm fire, with no threat hanging at the door, no widow staring at him as if kindness itself had just become dangerous. But the past rarely waited for a decent hour. Meredith looked toward Samuel. "Go check Ruby's blanket." Samuel did not move. "Pa." Jonas crossed the room and knelt in front of him. "You remember Laramie." The boy nodded slowly. "You remember the smoke." Samuel's eyes filled, but he did not cry. "You said not to look back." "I did." "Did you burn it?" The question was small. It nearly broke Jonas. "No, son, I did not." Samuel stared at him, needing more than love, needing truth. Jonas placed a hand over the boy's. "I stayed too long trying to stop it." Meredith said nothing, she only waited. At last, Jonas rose and stood near the stove, not warming himself, just facing the heat because he could not bear everyone's eyes at once. "It was 2 years ago," he said, "before Lydia died. I was working with a repair crew along the freight line west of Laramie. The bridge carried supply wagons over a dry creek bed. It was old but not useless. I told the freight boss the center beams needed replacing before heavy loads crossed in winter." "Did he listen?" Meredith asked. "No, replacing timber cost money. Waiting cost nothing, or so he thought." Jonas rubbed both hands over his face. One night a lantern fell in the tool shed near the bridge. Wind took the flame into spilled pitch and dry shavings. By the time I reached it, fire had climbed the side braces. I cut 2 mules loose and dragged 1 man out of the shed. Then I went back for the plans and tools because I thought if I saved them, we could rebuild faster. His mouth tightened. "A beam fell not on me, on a young hand named Aaron Pike, Noah Pike's brother." Meredith's breath caught softly. Jonas looked at her. "I pulled him clear, but he had breathed too much smoke. He lived until morning." Samuel looked down at his biscuit. "People wanted someone to blame," Jonas continued. "The freight boss said I had argued about the bridge for weeks, said I had a temper, said maybe I started the fire to prove him wrong. There was no proof, no charge that held, but a story does not need a judge to follow a man." Meredith stared at the folded paper. "Grant found that story. Or someone gave it to him. You should have told me." "I know." Her eyes lifted sharply. "Before I named you foreman in front of town, before I put your work between my ranch and Grant Sutter, before my neighbors are asked to trust a man with a burned bridge behind him." Jonas accepted every word. "Yes." The room fell quiet. Outside, the wind dragged snow across the porch boards with a dry hiss. Meredith turned away, but not because she hated him. That might have been easier. She turned away because she could still see him with Ruby in his arms, with Samuel at his side, with blood on his cheek after cutting open a wall he had built wrong. She could still hear him saying a weakness should not hide behind success. Now there was a weakness between them. And he had hidden it. Jonas reached for his hat. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight." Samuel stood quickly. "Pa, no." Jonas looked at Meredith. "I won't put your name under my shadow." Meredith turned back. "Do not make noble choices in my kitchen without asking me." He stopped. Her voice trembled then just a little. "You think leaving the house protects me? Grant wants me alone. If you walk out in shame, he gets half of what he came for." I lied by silence. "Yes." The single word hurt more than anger. Meredith stepped closer. "And tomorrow Inspector Price comes. Grant will not wait. By noon, half of Red Hollow will have heard that paper read wrong, so you will not hide in the barn, you will stand in daylight and tell the whole of it." Jonas's jaw tightened. "And if they don't believe me? Then they will have to disbelieve you while looking at your work." For a moment he could not speak. Samuel moved to Meredith's side, not fully hiding behind her but close enough to show where trust had begun taking root. Ruby woke in the cradle and gave a soft cry. Meredith picked her up without looking away from Jonas. The baby settled against her shoulder. Jonas watched them, and the shame in his face deepened into something more tender and more afraid. "I should have told you," he said again, softer now. "Yes," Meredith answered, "you should have." Then, after a long pause, she added, "But you are still eating breakfast at this table." That was all the forgiveness she could offer that night. And for Jonas, it was more than he deserved. By morning, the ranch felt braced for more than weather. Edwin Price arrived just after sunup with a notebook, a measuring line, and the hard patience of a man who trusted frost more than speeches. He inspected the hay crib first. Jonas showed him where the old stack had soured and how the smaller stacks left air channels between them. Edwin pressed his hand deep into the hay. "Cool." "Yes," Jonas said, "we check it morning and evening." "Who records it?" Meredith opened the ledger. "I do." Samuel stepped forward. I write the temperature. Edwin looked at the boy. Then write this one, 21 degrees outside, 32 inside the milk barn. Samuel took the pencil, as if it were a duty given by law. They moved to the pump line next. Edwin knelt beside the boxed coupling and frowned. This may still freeze where metal meets air. Jonas nodded. It might. Edwin looked up, surprised by the admission. If it does, Jonas continued, we lower the exposed joint and add a second cover with dry wool around the cold bridge. I left enough space to open it fast. Edwin made a note. You expect failure. I expect Winter to find what I missed. Meredith glanced at him. The words carried another meaning now, and both of them knew it. At the barn, Edwin checked bedding moisture, ventilation, the offset passage, the lantern hook, and the willow windbreak. He said very little. That worried Meredith more than open criticism. Near midday, hoofbeats sounded. Grant Sutter rode in with 2 ranchers and Noah Pike. Noah was a broad-shouldered hired hand with tired eyes and a hard mouth. He had worked for Grant since his younger brother's death near Laramie. The moment he saw Jonas, hatred rose plainly in his face. Meredith stepped down from the barn entrance. This is an inspection, not a town meeting. Grant removed his gloves slowly. Mr. Pike has something to say. Noah pointed at Jonas. That man was at Laramie when my brother died. Jonas did not move. I was. You argued with the boss for weeks, said the bridge ought to come down. I said it needed repair. Then it burned. Yes. Noah's face twisted. Aaron died in that smoke. I know. You don't get to say his name. Jonas lowered his eyes. Fair enough. Grant looked toward Edwin. Would you trust your cattle to a man followed by fire and death? Meredith stepped forward before Jonas could answer. I trust my cattle to the man who lifted my hay before it spoiled, she said. To the man who drained my water line before it froze. To the man who cut open his own windbreak when it failed instead of pretending he was right. Grant smiled. You trust him because you are lonely. The words struck the yard like a slap. Jonas took 1 step forward, but Meredith's hand lifted, not touching him this time, simply stopping the moment from becoming what Grant wanted. She faced Grant fully. Yes, she said. The answer startled everyone. Meredith's eyes shone, but her voice did not break. I am lonely. My husband is dead. My table has had 1 cup beside the stove for 2 years. I work until my hands shake because if I stop, I hear how empty the house is. So yes, Mr. Sutter, I am lonely. Grant's smile faded. But loneliness has not made me foolish. It has made me careful. I know the difference between a man who wants my land and a man who warms milk before asking for wages. I know the difference between a man who uses my grief in public and a man who carries his own grief so quietly even I had to drag the truth from him. No one spoke. Meredith turned to Noah and her voice softened. I am sorry about your brother. Noah's jaw worked. I am, she said again. But if Jonas Whittaker pulled him from that fire, then your anger may be standing on the wrong side of the story. Noah looked at Jonas. Did you? Jonas's voice was rough. I did. Why didn't you save him? The question tore across the yard. Jonas did not defend himself, because I was not strong enough to carry him farther than I did. For the first time, Noah had no answer. Edwin closed his notebook. I came to inspect a ranch, not judge a dead man's bridge. From what I see, Winter Creek has made practical improvements. Some need monitoring. Some may fail under hard or cold, but the work is sound enough to test with records. Grant turned sharply. That is not approval. No, Edwin said, it is honesty. Grant mounted his horse, anger bright in his eyes. Winter will expose every lie. Jonas looked at the willow wall. It usually does. After they rode away, the ranch stood quiet except for the cattle shifting in the barn. Noah remained behind for a moment, still mounted, still staring at Jonas. At last he spoke. "My brother had a brass pocket watch. Did they find it?" Jonas looked up. "No." Noah's mouth tightened. Jonas walked to the tool shed and returned with a small cloth pouch. He held it out. "I kept it because no one would tell me where to send it." Noah stared at the pouch but did not take it right away. "I cleaned the smoke from it," Jonas said. "It stopped at 2:17. Noah took it with a hand that trembled once. Then he rode away without another word. That evening, Meredith found Jonas repairing a loose hinge on the barn door long after the inspection was done. Snow dusted his shoulders. His hands worked slowly as if the day had taken strength from them. She stood beside him. "You carried that watch for 2 years. I did not know how to let go of it. And now—" He looked toward the road Noah had taken. "Now it belongs to the right grief." Meredith's face softened. She reached up and brushed snow from his shoulder. It was a small gesture, almost nothing, but Jonas closed his eyes for a heartbeat as if kindness had touched a wound beneath the coat. "Meredith," he said. She waited. "I am not ready to love anyone." The honesty should have hurt. Instead, it felt like a door left open rather than slammed shut. She lowered her hand. "Neither am I." The wind moved between them. Then she added softly, "But I am ready to stop pretending I do not feel when you are near." Jonas looked at her then, and the whole winter yard seemed to hold its breath. Before he could answer, Samuel shouted from the porch. "Pa, Ruby's coughing bad." The moment broke. Jonas and Meredith ran for the house together, fear driving them through the falling snow, while behind them the first true cold front rolled over the Wyoming hills. Ruby's cough filled the little house like a warning bell. It was not loud at first, just a dry, tight sound from the unfinished cradle, followed by a small whimper that made Jonas Whittaker move faster than he had moved all winter. He reached her before Meredith did, lifting the baby with hands that had steadied beams, wagon wheels, and broken doors, yet trembled the moment they touched his child. Ruby's cheeks were hot, her breath came too quick. Samuel stood near the bed in his nightshirt, pale and frightened. She was fine before supper. Meredith placed the back of her fingers against Ruby's forehead. "She has a fever." Jonas's face changed. The room, the stove, the lantern, even Meredith seemed to fall away from him. For one terrible heartbeat, he was not in Winter Creek Ranch anymore. He was back in a railroad room outside Cheyenne, holding Lydia's hand while fever took her strength hour by hour and every remedy came too late. "No," he whispered. Meredith heard the old fear in his voice. "Jonas," she said firmly, "look at me." He did not. Ruby coughed again, weaker this time, and Jonas held her closer, as if his arms could keep death from entering. Meredith stepped in front of him and placed both hands lightly on Ruby's blanket. "Look at me." At last his eyes found hers. "This is not that night," she said. His jaw tightened. "This is Ruby. She is warm, but she is breathing. We have milk. We have fire. We have clean cloth. We have Ruth close enough to send for if the road holds. And we have you standing here not alone." The words reached him slowly, like light coming through a storm. Samuel began to cry without sound. Meredith looked over her shoulder. "Samuel, bring the blue bowl from the shelf, then fetch the clean cotton cloths from the chest." The boy moved at once, grateful for a task. Jonas sat with Ruby near the stove while Meredith warmed water and mixed a little milk with honey Ruth had left in a jar. She did not pretend to be a doctor. She did not make false promises. She only worked with calm hands. "Small sip," she said. Ruby turned her face away at first. Jonas tried, but his fear made him clumsy. Meredith touched his wrist. "Let me." For a second, he resisted. Ruby was his daughter, his last living piece of Lydia besides Samuel. Letting another woman tend her felt like stepping away from his own duty. Then Ruby coughed again. Jonas handed her over. Meredith took the baby against her shoulder and began the same low hum from the night before, not Lydia's song, her own, a frontier lullaby shaped from old grief and new tenderness. Ruby fussed, then quieted enough to take a few drops from the spoon. Jonas watched as if seeing both pain and mercy in the same image. By midnight, the cold outside had sharpened. Frost crawled thick along the window edges. The wind came in low bursts, testing the house chinking they had repaired. In the sleeping room, Samuel lay awake under the quilt, his eyes fixed on the cradle that now stood near the stove. No one slept. Jonas kept the fire steady. Meredith cooled Ruby's forehead with damp cloths. Every few minutes the baby stirred, coughed, took another sip and settled again against Meredith's chest. Near dawn the fever eased a little. Jonas noticed first. He leaned close, not trusting hope. Ruby's breathing had slowed. Her cheeks were still warm but not burning. He sat back with his face in both hands. Meredith lowered herself into the chair opposite him, Ruby asleep in her arms. "She will need watching," she said softly. Jonas nodded. "You should sleep an hour." He gave a rough breath that was almost a laugh. "I don't know how." Meredith looked down at Ruby. "Neither do I anymore." The room grew quiet. The 2 tin cups sat beside the stove, untouched and cooling. Samuel had finally drifted off, one hand over the edge of the bed as though still reaching for his sister. Jonas looked at Meredith holding his daughter. "When Lydia died, I thought the worst part would be missing her." Meredith did not speak. "But it was needing her." His voice broke on the last word. "Every time Ruby cried, every time Samuel asked a question I could not answer, every time I looked at a road and knew a baby should not be on it, I missed my wife, but I needed the mother of my children, and that made grief feel selfish." Meredith's eyes filled, but she did not look away. "It is not selfish to need help," she said. "I told myself it was. I told myself the same." He looked at her then. Meredith's thumb moved gently over Ruby's blanket. "After Daniel died, everyone came the first week. They brought pies, coffee, advice. Then they went home to their warm rooms and I stayed here with his boots by the door, his tools on the wall and that cradle unfinished in the loft." Her voice grew quieter. "I hated that cradle, then I hated myself for hating it." Jonas's eyes softened. "I never had children," she said. "Not because I did not want them, it simply never happened. Daniel said we had time, then the mountain took him and time became a cruel thing people said without understanding." Ruby shifted in her arms. Meredith held her closer. "When I carried this little girl inside the first night, I told myself I was only feeding a hungry child. But that was not the whole truth. The house heard her before I did. It started making room." Jonas stared at the fire. "You could have asked me to leave after the note," he said. "Yes. Why didn't you?" Meredith looked at him across the dim kitchen. "Because I have learned that a man can carry smoke on his coat and still not be the one who lit the fire." The words sank deep into him. For a long moment, Jonas could only sit there, the firelight moving across his tired face. Then Ruby opened her eyes and made a soft, weak sound. Meredith smiled down at her. "There you are." Jonas rose and stepped closer. "May I?" Meredith handed Ruby back with care. This time when Jonas took her, his hands were steadier. Samuel woke near sunrise and sat up quickly. "Is she better?" Jonas turned toward him. "A little." The boy climbed from bed and came to stand beside Meredith. For once, he did not keep distance. He leaned lightly against her arm, too tired to remember caution. Meredith looked down at him. Samuel whispered, "Thank you for not letting her go." Meredith pressed her lips together, fighting tears. She rested one hand on his hair. "She is staying right here," she said. Outside, the ranch waited beneath a hard silver morning. The inspection ledger still needed filling. The windbreak still needed strengthening. The council still had not given its final vote. Grant Sutter still watched from somewhere beyond the ridge. winter still had not shown its full hand. But inside that kitchen, something had changed. Jonas had handed Meredith his child in fear. Meredith had handed the child back alive. No promise had been spoken between them, yet the silence felt different now. Less like two lonely people sharing shelter, more like a family standing carefully at the edge of being born. By afternoon, Ruby's fever stayed low enough for Meredith to step outside. Jonas remained inside with the children, and Meredith crossed the yard alone with the ledger tucked under her arm. The sun was weak, but bright enough to make the frost shine on every rail. She checked the barn temperature, 31 degrees, bedding dry, water line clear, windbreak holding. As she wrote the numbers, she noticed a horseman on the far ridge. Grant Sutter. He sat still in the saddle, watching the ranch like a man waiting for a crack to widen. Meredith closed the ledger and held it against her chest. For the first time, she did not feel smaller under his stare. She felt angry. Not wild anger, not foolish anger. The steady kind that rose when a woman finally understood exactly what she was fighting for. That evening, Edwin Price returned briefly to collect the first inspection notes. He found Jonas inside holding Ruby while Samuel read numbers from the ledger aloud to Meredith. Edwin paused at the doorway, taking in the scene. "Baby sick?" he asked. "Fever broke," Meredith said. He nodded once, then opened his notebook. Weather office sent word through town, hard front expected within 10 days, could be heavy. Jonas looked up. How heavy? Enough that anyone short on feed or water will regret it. Meredith's hand tightened around the pencil. Edwin looked at Jonas. "Your records matter now. If your improvements hold through the next front, I can speak stronger at council." "And if they do?" Samuel asked. Edwin studied the boy kindly. "Then we learn what failed before the real storm." After he left, Jonas stood by the window, Ruby asleep against his shoulder. Meredith joined him close enough that their sleeves touched. Across the yard, the willow windbreak stood black against the snow-bright ground. "We need more hay near the barn," Jonas said. "More firewood split, more marker posts. The guide rope from the house to the barn should go up before the front, not after." Meredith nodded. "Then we start tomorrow." He looked at her. "You trust me still?" She turned her face toward him. The last light of day rested along her cheek. "I trust you more now," she said, "but not because you were innocent of every mistake." "Then why?" "Because you stayed when shame told you to run." Jonas looked at her for a long breath. This time, when his hand lifted, he did not stop himself. He touched the loose strand of hair near her cheek and tucked it gently behind her ear. Meredith closed her eyes for only a second. No kiss came, no confession, only that small touch, warmer than the stove and more dangerous than the wind. Then Samuel's voice came from the table. "Pa." Jonas lowered his hand. Samuel was looking at the window. "There's someone by the barn." Jonas turned. A dark figure moved near the windbreak, half hidden by the falling dusk. Meredith reached for the lantern. Jonas handed Ruby to her and opened the door. Cold air rushed in. The figure ran. By the time Jonas reached the windbreak, whoever had been there was gone. But one of the main willow lashings had been cut clean through, and beneath it, pressed into the frozen mud, was the sharp print of a fine city boot. Grant Sutter had stopped waiting for winter to expose the ranch. Now someone was helping it fail. For a long moment, Jonas Whitaker stood beside the cut lashing and said nothing. The dusk had gone blue around him. Wind moved through the willow wall with a dry whisper, and the loose section shifted against its frame like a wounded thing trying to hold itself upright. The cut was clean, too clean for weather, too clean for wear. A knife had done it. Meredith Cole came behind him, with the lantern held high. The light fell across the broken rope, the frozen mud, and the deep boot print pressed near the base of the windbreak. It was not the print of a ranch hand's work boot. The heel was narrow. The sole was fine, a town boot, the kind a man wore when he wanted to look important while others did his dirty work. Meredith's face hardened. "Grant," she said. Jonas crouched and touched the cut end of the rope. "Maybe. You think this is chance?" "No," he stood slowly. "But if we accuse him without proof, he will turn it into another story about a lonely widow and a drifter causing trouble." The word drifter tasted bitter in his mouth now. He had accepted it from strangers. He had even believed it some nights. But here, with Samuel asleep in the house, Ruby recovering near the stove, and Meredith standing beside him in the cold, the word no longer fit. Meredith looked toward the far ridge where darkness had swallowed the road. "He wants the ranch weak before the council vote. He wants us angry enough to look foolish." "And what do you want?" Jonas turned toward the broken willow frame. "To fix this before the next wind." That answer should have disappointed her. Instead, it steadied her. They worked by lantern light. Jonas cut away the damaged rope. Meredith fetched fresh rawhide strips from the shed. The air grew colder, numbing their fingers through their gloves. The wall did not need a grand repair that night. It needed enough strength to hold until morning. Samuel appeared on the porch, wrapped in a quilt. "Go back inside," Jonas called. "I can hold the lantern." "You're cold." "I can hold the lantern," Samuel repeated, and his voice carried something new, not stubborn fear, purpose. Meredith looked at Jonas. He hesitated, then nodded. Samuel came down carefully, boots crunching over frozen ground. He held the lantern while Jonas braced the loose willow section and Meredith tied the rawhide tight. The boy's hands shook, but he did not complain. When they finished, Jonas stepped back and watched the wind move through the repaired gap. "It will hold tonight," he said. Meredith looked at Samuel. "You did well." The boy lowered his eyes, but a small proud smile touched his mouth. Inside the house, Ruby gave a soft cry. Meredith went to her at once. Jonas and Samuel followed after covering the repair tools. The kitchen felt warm but not peaceful. Trouble had entered without opening the door. Ruby's fever had not returned, though her cough still came in small spells. Meredith held her while Jonas checked the stove and Samuel sat by the table, staring at the lamp flame. "Why would someone cut it?" Samuel asked. Meredith sat across from him with Ruby against her shoulder. "Because some people are frightened by anything that proves them wrong." Samuel frowned. "That is a foolish reason." "It is," Jonas said, "but foolish reasons can still do harm." Samuel looked at his father. "Are we going to tell the inspector?" "Yes." "And the council?" "Yes." "Will they believe us?" Jonas glanced at Meredith. "We will give them what we have." Meredith rose, walked to the shelf, and took down the ledger. She opened to a clean page and wrote the date, the time, and exactly what they had found. Cut lashing on northwest windbreak. One fine boot print by damaged section. Temporary rawhide repair made before full dark. Witnesses: Meredith Cole, Jonas Whitaker, Samuel Whitaker. Then she placed the pencil in Samuel's hand. "Sign your name," she said. His eyes widened. "Me." "You held the lantern, that makes you a witness." Samuel stared at the page a moment, then carefully wrote his name in uneven letters. Jonas watched his son sign beside the adults, and emotion moved through him so strongly he had to look away. Samuel had once hidden bread because tomorrow felt impossible. Now he was putting his name in a ranch ledger because his word mattered. If you believe even a child's courage can help save a home, stay with this story, because Winter Creek is about to face the kind of storm that tests every promise made in warmth. The next morning, Jonas rose before dawn and inspected the windbreak from end to end. The rawhide had held. The fine boot print remained near the cut rope, hardened by frost. Meredith covered it with an overturned wooden crate so the sun would not soften it before Edwin Price arrived. When Edwin came near noon, he said little at first. He knelt beside the footprint, measured it with a bit of twine, examined the cut lashing, and read the ledger entry. Then he looked at Samuel. "You saw this?" Samuel stood straight. "Yes, sir. I held the lantern while Pa and Meredith fixed it." Edwin nodded. "Did you see who ran?" "No, sir, only a dark coat." Meredith folded her arms. "Grant Sutter wears a dark coat." "So do 10 men in town," Edwin said. Jonas respected the answer, though Meredith did not like it. Edwin placed the cut rope into a small cloth sack. "I cannot accuse a man on a boot print, but I can report interference with ranch preparations." "Will that matter?" Meredith asked. "It will if the council still has a spine." Before she could reply, hoofbeats came from the road. Noah Pike rode in, his horse breathing white clouds into the cold. He looked worse than he had the day before, as if sleep had not found him. The brass watch Jonas had returned hung from a chain in his hand. Jonas stiffened, but Noah lifted one gloved palm. "I did not come to fight." Meredith stepped down from the porch. "Why did you come?" Noah looked toward the windbreak. "Grant sent 2 men toward your place last night, said they were checking the road." Jonas's eyes narrowed. "Names?" Noah shook his head. "One was Russell Tate, other was a new hand from Rollins. I did not see them cut anything." "But you knew enough to ride here." Noah's face tightened. "I knew enough to feel wrong." He looked at Jonas then, and the hatred that had once filled his eyes had thinned into something harder to carry. "My brother's watch still smells like smoke," Noah said. "I sat with it all night, kept thinking if you wanted to hide from Laramie you would have thrown it away." Jonas said nothing. Noah swallowed. "Grant told me you let Aaron die." Jonas's jaw worked, but his voice stayed quiet. "I carried him until my hands gave out." "I know that now." Noah looked toward Meredith. "I can say what I heard, but Grant pays my wages. If I stand against him at council, I lose my bunk before a storm." Meredith's face softened. "Truth is costly on this frontier." Noah gave a humorless laugh, "Cheaper for some than others." Jonas stepped forward. "Then do not spend it before you are ready." Noah looked at him surprised. "I know what it is to carry a story men use against you," Jonas said. "I won't ask you to take on one before the snow." For a moment, Noah seemed unable to answer. Then he looked toward the windbreak again. "Storm coming sooner than folks think. Grant's men are moving cattle toward his north barn. Bad place for this wind." Edwin turned sharply. "How bad?" Noah pointed northwest. "Doors face open ground. Snow piles there every year. He thinks because the barn is bigger it's safer." Jonas studied the sky. Low clouds were gathering in long gray ribs. The air had that strange, heavy stillness that came before a hard change. "We need marker posts today," he said. Meredith nodded, "and the guide rope." The rest of the afternoon became work without pause. They drove marker posts from the house to the barn every 18 feet, each one wrapped with a cloth strip high enough to see in drifting snow. Jonas tied a guide rope from the porch rail to the barn entrance, then a second shorter line toward the pump. Meredith moved hay closer to the barn but kept it raised and open to air. Samuel counted firewood by the stove. Ruth Bell arrived with dried apples, goat's milk, and a warning from the south road that birds had vanished from the creek bottoms. By evening the ranch looked strange and prepared, like a ship ready for a sea of snow. Jonas stood by the last marker post, tightening a knot with numb fingers. Meredith came beside him carrying his gloves, warmed from the stove. "You left these inside," she said. He took them slowly. "You keep noticing what I forget." "That is what people do when they are not alone." The words settled between them. The sky above the ridge had turned a deep iron color. No snow fell yet, that made it worse. Jonas looked toward the house. Through the window, Samuel could be seen rocking Ruby's cradle with one foot while reading numbers from the ledger. Ruth moved around the stove. The room glowed with lamplight. "I should be frightened," Meredith said. "Aren't you?" "Yes," she pulled her shawl tighter, "but not the way I used to be." "How did you used to be frightened?" Quietly, like if I admitted it, the ranch would hear and give up. She looked at him. Now I am frightened with someone beside me, it feels different. Jonas wanted to answer, but the words would not come cleanly. His heart had been careful for so long that tenderness felt almost like stepping onto thin ice. Meredith seemed to understand. She reached out and took his hand. Not for long, not with any grand confession. Just one gloved hand around his, warm from the stove. Jonas looked down at their joined hands. Then slowly, he turned his hand and held hers back. The wind died. Every sound on the ranch seemed to stop with it. The willow strips hung still. The cattle in the barn went quiet. Even the old porch boards seemed to hold their breath. Ruth opened the kitchen door behind them. That kind of quiet never means mercy. A bell rang faintly from the direction of Red Hollow, one slow warning, then another. Jonas released Meredith's hand, but not as if pulling away, as if preparing to protect what that touch had finally admitted. Inside, he said. The first snowflake landed on Meredith's sleeve. Then another. Within minutes, the hills disappeared. By midnight, the storm had become a white wall. Wind struck from the northwest with a force that shook the house logs. Snow raced sideways past the windows. The willow windbreak bent hard but held. The guide rope hummed under the pressure of the storm. Jonas and Meredith crossed to the barn together, clipped to the rope, lanterns held low. Samuel watched from the porch until Ruth pulled him back inside. The barn doors opened, not easily, but they opened. Inside, the cattle stood nervous but safe. The water line still flowed. The bedding stayed dry. The lantern at the widened bend kept the old milk cow from balking. Jonas checked the trough drain, then looked at Meredith through the lantern glow. So far, he said. So far, she answered. A hard gust slammed into the barn. The roof groaned above them. Snow hissed through one small crack near the door, then vanished as the windbreak took the force. Meredith looked around at the animals, the dry straw, the open entrance, the markers barely visible outside. Every repair, every record, every mistake corrected before dark. All of it mattered now. Then, through the roar of the blizzard, came a pounding sound from beyond the windbreak. Jonas froze. Meredith lifted the lantern. Again the sound came, wood against wood or a fist against a post. Someone was out there in the storm. Jonas clipped himself to the guide rope. Meredith grabbed his arm. No. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the same man who had walked into smoke at Laramie and come out carrying another man's brother. If that is a person, he said, the posts may be the only reason they are still close enough to hear. Meredith's hand tightened around his sleeve. Then she took the other end of the rope. I hold the line, she said. Jonas nodded once and stepped into the white darkness. The storm swallowed him before he reached the second marker. The blizzard took Jonas Whittaker in one breath. One step beyond the barn, he could still see the lantern in Meredith's hand. 2 steps later, she became a dim gold blur. By the third marker post, there was only white, wild motion and the hard pull of the guide rope around his waist. Snow struck his face like handfuls of sand. Wind shoved at his chest, trying to turn him from the line. He kept one glove on the rope and the other stretched ahead, feeling for the next post. The cloth strip snapped against his wrist before he saw it. Behind him, Meredith stood in the barn entrance with both boots braced against the boards. The rope ran through her gloved hands. Every few seconds it jerked, and each time her heart seemed to jerk with it. She could not see Jonas now. She could only feel him. That frightened her more than darkness. Hold, she whispered, though he could not hear her. Hold Jonas. Inside the barn, cattle shifted nervously. The lantern at the passage bend swung in the gusts, throwing broken light across the straw. The repaired doors groaned, but the snow still drifted away from the entrance instead of packing it shut. The willow wall was doing its work, but somewhere beyond it, someone or something had struck those posts. Another dull sound came through the storm. Jonas heard it too. He dropped low, nearly crawling now. The wind was stronger near the open stretch beyond the wall. The fourth marker leaned hard but still stood. He reached it, wrapped one arm around the post and looked ahead. Nothing. Then a shape moved low in the snow. Jonas pushed forward, his boots sank to the knee, the rope tightened behind him. Meredith felt it and gave him more line with shaking hands. He reached the shape and found a man half buried beside the next marker. Noah Pike. His hat was gone, snow crusted his beard and eyebrows, his lips had turned pale. One hand was locked around the marker post so tightly Jonas had to pry it loose. Noah, Jonas shouted. The man's eyes opened a slit. I saw the cloth, Noah whispered, barely louder than the wind, kept walking toward it. Jonas looped one arm beneath him and pulled. Noah groaned but could not stand. His legs folded under him. Jonas looked back, but the barn was invisible. He tugged the rope twice. Inside the barn entrance, Meredith felt the signal. 2 pulls found someone. Her throat tightened. She wrapped the rope once around the heavy door brace and pulled back with all her weight. Jonas dragged Noah through the snow one terrible foot at a time. The wind hit them sideways. Twice he fell. Twice the rope kept both men from sliding off the marked path. At the 4th post, Noah lost consciousness. Jonas hooked his arm through the man's coat and kept moving. By the time the gold blur of the barn lantern appeared, Jonas's lungs burned like fire. Meredith saw him on his knees, dragging another body through the storm. She tied off the rope and ran forward, staying clipped to the guide line. Together, they pulled Noah through the barn entrance and slammed the doors behind them. For a moment, no one moved. Then Meredith dropped beside Noah and pulled off his frozen gloves. Get blankets. Jonas was already moving. They carried him to the house between them, tied to the guide rope every step. Ruth Bell opened the door before they reached the porch. Warmth spilled out. Samuel stood behind her, white-faced, holding Ruby wrapped against his chest. When he saw Noah, his eyes widened. Is he dead? No, Meredith said, and he won't be if we move fast. They laid Noah near the stove, not too close. Ruth worked with the steady calm of a woman who had seen winter nearly win before. She removed his wet coat, wrapped his hands in cloth, and warmed his face slowly. Jonas brought blankets. Meredith warmed milk and broth. Samuel stood ready with towels, no longer asking whether he was useful. Noah woke near midnight with a sharp breath. His eyes found Jonas first. You came, he rasped. Jonas sat back on his heels, exhausted and snow-soaked. You were on our posts. Noah swallowed. Grant's north barn is failing. Wind got through the doors, cattle packed hard inside, men scattered trying to reach the water trough. I lost the road. Meredith's face tightened. Where is Grant? At his ranch, unless he tried to come after us. Noah coughed, then winced. He would not listen, said his barn was bigger than yours, said willow walls were poor men's toys. Ruth muttered something under her breath that sounded almost like a prayer and almost like an insult. Jonah stood, but Meredith caught his sleeve. No, she said before he spoke. He looked at her. You are thinking about going there. His men may still be out. The inspector warned no one to leave shelter. Noah left shelter and found our posts. Because he was close enough. Jonas's voice lowered. If we hear another sound out there, I have to look. Meredith stared at him, fear and anger fighting in her eyes. Must you always walk toward the thing that can take you? He had no answer that would comfort her. Ruby coughed softly from Samuel's arms. The sound pulled both of their eyes toward the children. Noah's voice came weakly from the floor. Don't go for Grant, not in this, you'll never reach him. Jonas looked toward the shaking window. The blizzard pressed white against the glass until the world beyond the house was gone. So he stayed. But staying did not mean resting. Through the night, Jonas and Meredith took turns crossing to the barn. The guide rope held. The marker posts showed enough cloth to follow. The barn doors opened each time. The water line still drained clear. The cattle were frightened but safe. Just before dawn, trouble came from inside the barn. Maple, the oldest milk cow, went into labor. Meredith knew it the moment she saw the animal's body strain wrong. She handed Jonas the lantern and moved in close, calm but pale. "It is too early," Jonas said. "Yes." "Can she deliver?" Meredith rolled up her sleeves. "She will if I can turn the calf." There was no doctor coming, no neighbor, no help beyond those inside Winter Creek Ranch. Jonas held the lantern while Meredith washed her hands in warm water carried from the house. The water line had made that possible. The dry bedding kept Maple from lying in frozen filth. The widened passage kept the other cattle from crowding the stall. Every repair they had argued over now stood quietly between life and loss. Samuel appeared at the barn door, clipped to the guide rope, wrapped in his coat. Jonas turned sharply. "Samuel, go back." "I brought clean cloths," the boy said. Meredith looked over. "Set them there, then hold the lantern low where Maple can see the light." Samuel obeyed, trembling but brave. Meredith worked slowly, speaking to the cow in a low voice. "Easy, girl, easy now, we are not leaving you." Jonas heard those words and knew they were meant for more than the animal. The minutes stretched, Maple strained, Meredith's face tightened with effort. At last she found the calf's legs and nodded to Jonas. "Now." Together they pulled. The calf slid onto the straw, wet and still. Samuel stopped breathing. Jonas dropped to his knees and rubbed the calf hard with clean straw. Meredith cleared its mouth, her hands steady though her eyes were bright with fear. "Come on," Jonas whispered, "come on now." Nothing. The barn seemed to disappear around them. There was only the small, unmoving body, Maple's low call, Samuel's terrified face, and Meredith's hands working with desperate care. Then the calf jerked. A thin breath came. Samuel gasped like he had taken the breath himself. Meredith closed her eyes for one brief second, then opened them and went right back to work. Dry cloth. Samuel handed it to her. Jonas looked at the boy. "You did good." Samuel's mouth trembled. It breathed. "Yes," Jonas said, his own voice rough. "It breathed." Outside, the storm roared as though offended that anything inside the barn had chosen life. By late morning, the blizzard grew worse. The third day brought the hardest wind. Snow had buried 2 lower marker posts. Only the cloth strips showed where the line continued. The willow windbreak bowed under the pressure, and the rawhide repair from the cut lashing strained at every gust. Noah, weak but awake near the stove, insisted on sitting up. Ruth kept him wrapped in blankets and refused to let him stand. Around noon, a crack sounded from the yard. Meredith was at the window with Ruby in her arms. She saw one section of the willow frame whip loose near the north corner. Her face went pale. "Jonas." He was already pulling on his coat. "No," she said. "If that section goes, the wind pours straight into the barn entrance." "Then let me go." He stared at her. "Meredith. It is my ranch. And you are Ruby's warmth right now, Samuel's too." His voice softened. "Please hold the rope." The word "please" undid her, more than any command could have. They reached the barn together. The loose willow lattice slammed back and forth, each blow threatening to tear the whole north arm away. Snow began curling toward the entrance in thin, dangerous lines. Jonas tied the rope around his waist. Meredith wrapped the other end around both hands. Their eyes met in the stormlit dimness of the barn. "I am not ready to love anyone," he had told her once. Now his face said what fear had not let his mouth finish. Meredith stepped closer and pressed his gloves hard into his hands. "Then come back before either of us has to say what we are ready for." Jonas held her gaze one heartbeat longer. Then he stepped out. The storm hit him sideways, knocking him to one knee before he reached the first post. He crawled from marker to marker, keeping low. The rope dragged behind him, alive in Meredith's hands. Each pull told her he was still moving. Each pause stole the breath from her chest. The loose willow panel struck him at the shoulder and threw him flat into the snow. "Jonas," Meredith shouted, though the storm swallowed his name. Inside the barn, Samuel began to cry, not loudly, not like a small child, like someone old enough to understand what could happen and too young to stop it. Meredith felt one tug. Then nothing. The rope lay still. She pulled once. No answer. She pulled again, harder. Still nothing. Her heart went cold in a way no winter could explain. Then 3 sharp tugs came through the line. "Give rope." Meredith choked on a breath and fed the rope out. Jonas had reached the broken frame. His repair bag had burst open, but the old leather strap from his wife's sewing held it from blowing away completely. Tools scattered, half buried in snow. He grabbed a spare willow pole, shoved it across the broken section, and lashed it, not the pretty way, not the lasting way, but the way that might keep the barn alive until dawn. Wind tore at his coat, his fingers had gone numb. Twice he dropped the rawhide, twice he found it again by touch. At last the panel stopped whipping. It held. Jonas tugged twice. Meredith pulled with everything in her. He came out of the white darkness on one knee, then both hands, dragging himself along the rope. She ran forward as far as the line allowed and caught his coat. Together they fell back through the barn entrance. The door slammed shut behind them. Jonas lay on the straw, breathing hard. Snow covered his beard, his hair, his shoulders. His lips had gone pale, but his eyes found Meredith. "It will hold until morning," he said. Meredith dropped beside him, one hand on his face. "Morning is enough," she whispered. This time she did not hide the tenderness in her voice. Samuel saw it. Ruth saw it when they brought him inside. Even Noah, half asleep by the stove, saw the way Meredith kept one hand around Jonas's wrist until color returned to his fingers. No one spoke of it. Some truths are too sacred for a room full of fear. By the 4th morning, the wind finally weakened. Not stopped. Winter Creek Ranch did not receive that much mercy, but the worst of the roar faded into a long, tired howl. Gray light seeped through the windows. Snow still covered the yard, but the house stood. The barn stood. The willow windbreak leaned and splintered, but it stood. Jonas, Meredith, Samuel, Ruth, and Noah stepped outside together. They counted slowly. Every Maine animal alive. The newborn calf weak but breathing. Water still flowing. Hay dry. Barn entrance open. House warm. Children safe. For the first time in days, Meredith let herself close her eyes. Jonas stood beside her, looking not at what survived but at what nearly failed. The broken lashing, the shallow-set marker, the brace that needed doubling. Meredith opened her eyes and saw him making notes in his head already. "You count weaknesses before blessings," she said softly. He looked at her. Blessings deserve protection. She looked toward the house, where Ruby's cough had faded and Samuel stood taller than he had when he arrived. Then she looked at the man who had come asking only for milk and had nearly given his life to protect a ranch that was not his. "It is yours too," she said. Jonas turned. Meredith did not look away. "Not by paper, not yet, but by every mark of your hands." Before he could answer, riders appeared through the thinning snow. Edwin Price came first. Behind him rode Amos Reed from the council. And behind them, with his dark coat torn by wind and his proud face changed by loss, came Grant Sutter. His north barn had failed. Winter had finally spoken, and now every man in Red Hollow had come to see whose story survived the storm. The riders came slowly through the broken white morning, their horses stepping high through the drifts. Edwin Price reached the yard first, his gray coat stiff with frost, his face serious beneath the brim of his hat. Amos Reed followed, the council chairman looking older than he had in the meeting hall, as if the storm had taken pride out of his bones. Behind them rode 3 ranchers from Red Hollow, men who had laughed at Jonas Whittaker's willow wall only days before. Last came Grant Sutter. He was no longer smiling. His fine dark coat was torn at one sleeve. Snow clung to his beard. One side of his face had been scratched by flying ice or splintered wood. He sat stiff in the saddle, not wounded badly, but marked enough for everyone to see that Winter had not cared about his money. Meredith Cole stood in front of the porch with Ruby wrapped against her chest. Samuel stood beside Jonas, his small hand gripping the ledger as if it were a family Bible. Ruth Bell watched from the doorway, arms folded. Noah Pike leaned against the porch rail, still weak but standing. Edwin Price dismounted and looked across Winter Creek Ranch. The barn doors were open. The cattle were alive. The water trough steamed faintly in the cold. The willow windbreak leaned hard to one side, patched with rawhide, spare poles, and stubbornness, but it had held. Beyond it, snow had piled exactly where Jonas had said it would, away from the barn entrance, away from the path that kept animals and people alive. Edwin walked the yard without speaking. He checked the trough. He touched the bedding. He stepped into the barn and looked at Maple standing protectively beside her weak newborn calf. He inspected the damaged windbreak, the marker posts, the guide rope, and the repaired lashing that had been cut before the storm. At last he returned to the porch. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "your ranch held better than any place I have inspected this morning." A quiet sound moved through the group, not celebration, something humbler, respect. Meredith held Ruby a little closer, "Because we fixed what we could before the storm." Edwin nodded, and because someone knew where the storm would strike. All eyes turned toward Jonas. He stood uncomfortable beneath the attention, his coat still damp at the hem, his hands red from cold. He looked less like a hero than a man already thinking about the next broken board. Amos Reed removed his hat. "Mr. Whittaker, Red Hollow owes you an apology." Jonas glanced toward Meredith before answering. "No, sir, Red Hollow owes its people better preparation." Amos accepted the correction with a slow nod. Grant Sutter dismounted then. For a moment everyone watched him. The proud rancher crossed the yard, his boots sinking into snow, and stopped near the broken willow wall. "My north barn lost the roof edge," he said, voice low. "Doors packed shut before dawn yesterday. We dug until our hands bled, lost cattle, nearly lost 2 men." No one answered. Grant looked at Jonas. "Noah told us the marker post saved him." Jonas looked toward Noah. The hired hand lowered his eyes but did not deny it. Grant's jaw tightened. "I was wrong about the wall." The words seemed to cost him more than money. Meredith looked at him steadily. "You were wrong about more than the wall." Grant's face hardened for a second out of old habit, but the storm had stripped too much from him. Pride came slower now. Edwin reached into his coat and took out the cloth sack holding the cut lashing. "I will be sending a report to the council about interference with Winter Creek's winter preparations." Grant looked at the sack, then away. Amos Reed's voice sharpened. "Do you know who cut it?" Grant did not answer quickly. A long silence stretched over the yard. Then Noah Pike stepped forward from the porch. His legs were unsteady, but his voice was clear. "Russell Tate and a Rollins hand rode this way under Mr. Sutter's orders. I heard him tell them to check the wall and make sure Mrs. Cole's fancy repair did not make fools of us." Grant turned on him, careful. Noah held up the brass watch Jonas had returned to him. "I spent 2 years being careful with the wrong man." Grant's mouth opened, then closed. Edwin's eyes did not leave him. "Did you order them to damage the windbreak?" Grant's face worked, pride fighting truth. At last he looked toward the barn that had survived while his own had failed. "I told them to scare her," he said, "not to ruin it." Meredith's voice was cold. "In winter there is no difference." The word struck harder than shouting. Grant lowered his head, "Not much but enough." Amos Reed turned to Meredith. The council will restore full Winter Road priority to Winter Creek. Shared clearing begins as soon as teams can move, and Mr. Sutter will answer for interference. Grant did not protest, perhaps because there were too many witnesses, perhaps because even he knew Winter had already judged him. Meredith looked at the men gathered in her yard. "I do not want revenge, I want my ranch left alone." "You will have it," Amos said. Jonas glanced at her, hearing the strength in her voice. She did not sound like a widow begging to keep what remained. She sounded like a woman claiming the life she had rebuilt with both hands. By noon, the visitors had inspected the last repairs and prepared to leave. Before mounting, Grant stopped near Jonas. "How far from the barn?" he asked. Jonas understood. 32 feet at the closest point, more where the ground dips, but do not copy the number blind. Watch where your snow settled. Grant nodded once, and the weave. Loose enough to let the wind spend itself. Grant looked toward Meredith. "If I send willow poles tomorrow." Meredith lifted one brow. "Send them straight, no hired men with knives." A few ranchers laughed softly. Grant accepted the shame without reply, mounted his horse and rode away. That was the kind of justice the frontier understood best, not a grand punishment, not a bloody reckoning, just a proud man forced to ask help from the people he had tried to break. When the yard emptied, quiet returned slowly. Ruth took Ruby inside. Noah went with Edwin toward town, carrying his brother's watch and a different kind of grief. Samuel remained by the porch, still holding the ledger. Meredith and Jonas stood together near the windbreak. The wall looked ugly in daylight, bent posts, torn willow, rawhide strips tied in haste. A spare pole braced across the wounded section, but behind it the barn doors stood clear. "It needs rebuilding," Jonas said. Meredith looked at him. "Of course that is the first thing you say." He gave a tired smile. "It is true." "So is this," she turned toward him. "You saved my ranch." Jonas shook his head. "No, we did." Samuel held lanterns. "Ruth kept the children warm. You turned that calf. Edwin told us what might fail. Even Noah brought warning. And you stayed." The simple words quieted him. Meredith stepped closer. The wind moved lightly now, lifting loose strands of her auburn hair. Jonas wanted to touch them again, but this time he did not move first. She did. Her gloved hand reached for his. "I spent 2 years thinking strength meant needing no one," she said. Jonas looked down at their joined hands. "I spent 6 months thinking love was something I had already used up," he answered. Meredith's eyes softened. Maybe love is not used up, maybe it changes shape until someone is brave enough to recognize it. He looked at the house, where Samuel's small figure waited in the doorway and Ruby's cry rose faintly from inside, hungry and healthy. Then he looked back at Meredith. "I came here asking for milk," he said. "You gave my house a heartbeat." His voice lowered. "I cannot promise I will never be afraid. I would not believe you if you did. I cannot promise there will be no hard winters. We just survived one. I cannot replace Daniel." Meredith's eyes filled, but her smile stayed steady. "I never asked you to. Love does not need one grave emptied before another heart is allowed to live." Jonas closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something in him had finally stopped running. "Then I can promise this," he said. "I will stay through the rebuilding, through spring thaw, through the next winter after that. Through every broken gate, frozen line, and stubborn cow that lets me earn my place here." Meredith gave a small laugh through tears. "That sounds almost romantic." "It is the best I can do with frozen hands." This time she stepped into his arms. The kiss was gentle. No storm, no rush, no grand show for the valley. Just 2 tired people standing beside a battered windbreak, choosing warmth after grief had taught them cold. On the porch, Samuel pretended not to watch. Then Ruby cried louder from inside and Ruth called, "If you two are finished saving the world, this baby wants milk." Meredith laughed for real then. Jonas had not heard that sound from her before. It made the whole white yard feel less like winter. The weeks that followed were full of work. The council cleared the road. Edwin's report spread across the basin. Ranchers came to Winter Creek not to mock the willow wall but to learn from it. Jonas never charged the desperate ones. He only told them to keep records, watch the wind, and fix small failures before they became graves. Grant Sutter sent straight willow poles 3 days after the storm. No note came with them. Meredith accepted them anyway. Noah Pike left Grant's employ before spring and took work with a smaller ranch near Red Hollow. Before he rode away, he shook Jonas's hand. Neither man spoke of Laramie. They did not need to. The brass watch now rested where it belonged, against Noah's heart. By March, Samuel no longer hid bread in his coat. He still saved things, but now they were useful things: nails, bits of twine, pencil stubs for the ledger. He began to laugh more often, especially when Ruby pulled at Jonas's beard. One evening, he stood beside Meredith while she recorded the last of the winter feed numbers. "Do I have to call you something different?" he asked. Meredith kept her pencil still. "Only if you truly want to." Samuel thought about it. "Meredith is easier." She smiled, though her heart pinched. "Then Meredith is fine." 2 weeks later, when he slipped on the muddy porch and she ran to help him, he caught himself saying, "Mommer." He stopped, embarrassed. Meredith brushed dirt from his sleeve and pretended not to hear the part he was not ready to finish. Some loves needed time. She had learned not to pull on a tender thing before it rooted. In early May, when grass returned soft and green along the creek, Jonas and Meredith married under the cottonwood trees Daniel had planted. They did not cut them down. Jonas trimmed the dead branches and built the better windbreak beyond them, leaving the old row standing as a memory that still had shelter to give. Ruth Bell baked 2 small cakes. Edwin Price signed as witness. Amos Reed brought coffee. Noah sent a polished brass button from his brother's old coat for Samuel to keep with his ledger pencil. Grant did not attend, but another bundle of willow poles appeared by the fence that morning, straight and clean. That was apology enough. After the vows, Ruby took 3 unsteady steps across the new grass toward Meredith. Everyone went quiet. Meredith knelt, arms open but patient, letting the child come on her own. Ruby reached her, grabbed both sides of her dress, and said one clear word. "Ma." Meredith covered her mouth, but the tears came anyway. Jonas stood behind her with Samuel beside him. The boy looked at Ruby, then at Meredith, then down at his boots. After a moment, he slipped his hand into hers. He did not say the word yet. But he stayed. That was enough for that day. Years later, people in Red Hollow would still talk about the White Creek blizzard and the widow whose ranch survived because a hungry cowboy asked for milk. Some said Jonas saved Meredith. Some said Meredith saved Jonas. Those who knew them best understood the truth. They did not rescue each other like heroes in a dime novel. They simply stopped mistaking loneliness for strength. And every winter after, when the north wind crossed the Wyoming hills, it met a willow wall built with open spaces, a barn door that stayed clear, 2 tin cups waiting beside the stove, and a family that had learned the strongest homes are not the ones without weakness. They are the ones where someone stays long enough to fix what the storm finds. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more romantic Wild West stories where love, loss, and courage find each other on the frontier.